The Hunter's Curse. The sun hung lazily over Mabera village, its golden rays piercing through the thick canopy of ancient baobab trees. The air smelled of roasted plantains and burning firewood as the villagers prepared for the evening. Children ran barefoot through the dusty roads, while elders sat under the shade of the great council tree, exchanging stories of old. Among them, Jabari walked with his head lowered, a bundle of small game slung over his shoulder. His hunt had been meager, again. He had spent the entire day in the forest, his spear aimed high, his heart hopeful. But fortune was not kind to him. While other hunters returned with antelopes and wild boars, Jabari carried only 2 scrawny rabbits and a few birds. The moment he entered the village, laughter followed. Jabari the Mighty, a burly man named Ogun, bellowed, slapping his thigh. "Tell me, do you hunt for yourself or the rats?" The crowd roared with laughter. Jabari clenched his jaw but said nothing. Even Odona, the chief's daughter, stood nearby, her arms crossed as she eyed him with amusement. She was beautiful, tall, with dark, smooth skin that glowed in the sunlight, but her heart was sharp as a spear. "Jabari," she cooed mockingly. "Perhaps you should try fishing. The fish in the river might be easier for you to catch." The villagers burst into more laughter, and Jabari, swallowing his anger, walked past them in silence. What could he say? They were right. No matter how hard he tried, he always returned with small catches. At night, he sat outside his hut, gazing at the full moon. His father, a legendary hunter, had once sat in the same spot, his hands wrapped around a hunting spear much larger than the one Jabari now carried. He had spoken of honor and courage, of the spirits that guided true warriors. Yet, here Jabari was, a man mocked, a hunter with no glory. As he closed his eyes, the drums of the village square sounded. A meeting. Something was happening. Jabari hurried toward the gathering. The entire village was assembled before the council of elders, their faces solemn. In the center stood the great elder, his silver beard glowing in the moonlight. "People of Mabera," his voice rumbled like distant thunder. "The spirits have spoken. The village is cursed." A murmur rippled through the crowd. "The river is drying," he continued. "Our crops are failing. Our hunts are growing weaker. And the spirits demand a sacrifice." Jabari felt his heartbeat quicken. The elder turned his gaze directly toward him. "The spirits have chosen a man to lift this curse," he declared. "A man whose fate will decide the future of Mabera village." Jabari stiffened. He knew before the elder even said it. "Jabari, son of Keto, you must marry the fattest woman in the village." A heavy silence followed. Then, laughter. The hunters howled, villagers whispered, and Odona laughed the loudest of them all. Jabari's stomach twisted. Was this a joke? "Why must I do this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The elder raised a hand, silencing the crowd. His eyes gleamed with a wisdom that sent chills down Jabari's spine. "Because it is fate," he said simply. "And if you refuse, you must leave this village forever." The laughter died. The weight of the words crushed the air like a storm rolling over the land. Banished. Jabari staggered backward. He had been mocked before, humiliated, but this was different. 7 days, the elder announced. 7 days to choose your bride. If you fail, you will walk the world alone. The night of shame. Jabari could barely sleep that night. The village still echoed with whispers and cruel jokes. "Jabari will marry the elephant of Mabera," they jeered. Even in the shadows of his hut, he could hear them laughing. His mother's voice, long gone but never forgotten, whispered in his mind. "Strength is not in the arm, my son, but in the heart." What choice did he have? If he rejected the elders, he would be banished. He would have nowhere to go. But if he followed through, he would become an even bigger joke than he already was. Was this a test? Was there something he wasn't seeing? The journey begins. By dawn, Jabari made his choice. If this was a curse, he would find a way to break it. If this was a trick, he would uncover the truth. He packed his spear, a satchel of dried fruit, and a water skin. He would not choose a bride from the village that mocked him. Instead, he would go to the farthest part of Mabera, to the outcast, the forgotten, the unseen. Perhaps the spirits wanted him to find something greater than just a bride. As he stepped into the dense forest, the village still murmuring behind him, he whispered to himself, "I will not be their fool. I will be their lesson." And so, his journey began. The journey to the outskirts. Jabari walked alone, the whispers of the village fading behind him as he entered the dense wilderness that separated the main village from the far outskirts. The sun sat high, but beneath the thick canopy of trees, the air was cool and damp. His feet pressed against the soft earth, his hunting spear slung over his shoulder. He was no stranger to the forest, yet this journey felt different. For years, Jabari had hunted in these woods, searching for game, seeking the approval of men who would never respect him. But now, he wasn't hunting prey, he was hunting answers. Who was this woman he was meant to marry? Why had the spirits chosen him? And why did the elders' words feel like a test, not a punishment? As he moved deeper into the trees, the path grew wilder, the sounds of the village replaced by the chirping of birds and rustling leaves. Then, suddenly, a voice. "Jabari, son of Keto." He froze. The voice was old, yet strong, like the wind whispering through ancient trees. Jabari turned slowly, gripping his spear, only to find himself facing a small hut, hidden behind a wall of twisted vines. A hunched old woman sat on a low stool before the hut, her silver hair tied in thick braids, her wrinkled hands stirring a pot of herbs over a small fire. She smiled, her toothless grin eerie yet oddly comforting. "You walk a long road, boy," she murmured. "But your feet will not take you where you need to go." Jabari hesitated. "Who are you?" The old woman laughed, a sound like rustling leaves. "They call me Mama Ose," she said. "And I have been waiting for you." Jabari frowned. "Waiting for me?" Mama Ose nodded. "Because I know why you are here. You seek the one they mock, the one they fear." His heart skipped a beat. "You know where she is." The old woman motioned for him to sit. "First, tell me, Jabari, why do you seek this woman?" Jabari sat, shifting uncomfortably. "Because I must. The elders say I have 7 days to marry the fattest woman in the village, or I will be banished forever." Mama Ose stirred her pot, her eyes dark and knowing. "And what do you think of that?" Jabari hesitated. He wanted to say it was unfair, that it was a cruel joke. But something deep inside him whispered otherwise. He met Mama Ose's gaze. "I think, there is more to this than I am being told." The old woman grinned. "Good. You are not as blind as the others." She pointed her wooden spoon toward the path behind her hut. "Follow this road, Jabari, and you will find the one you seek." Jabari stood, adjusting his spear. "What is her name?" Mama Ose chuckled. "Her name is Amora. And when you meet her, boy, remember this." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Not all curses are what they seem." Jabari shivered. With a nod of thanks, he turned and followed the path into the unknown. Meeting Amora. The path twisted and turned, leading him further into the outskirts of Mabera, where the land grew wilder, and the trees grew taller. Here, the air smelled of damp earth and blooming flowers. Strange bird calls echoed, and the ground was dotted with wild mushrooms. Finally, after what felt like hours, the trees parted. Jabari stepped into a clearing and stopped in his tracks. Before him stood a small, tidy hut, surrounded by rows of clay pots filled with herbs and vegetables. A woven mat lay before the entrance, and in the center of the clearing, beside a small cooking fire, sat a woman. She was larger than any woman Jabari had ever seen, her thick arms stirring a pot over the fire. Her dark, braided hair was wrapped in a colorful headscarf, and her deep brown eyes gleamed in the light of the setting sun. She turned, her gaze falling upon him. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then, in a voice soft but strong, she said, "You are Jabari." Jabari swallowed. "And you are Amara." She studied him for a moment, then turned back to her cooking. "You've come to see the woman the village abandoned." Jabari shifted on his feet. I have come to ask for your hand in marriage." At that, Amara laughed. Not a cruel laugh, like the villagers, but a deep, hearty laugh. She gestured to a wooden stool beside her. "Sit, Hunter," she said. "Let us talk first. The truth about Amara." As the stars began to appear in the sky, Jabari and Amara sat beside the fire. She listened as he told her about the elder's command, the villagers' cruelty, and his journey into the forest. Then, Amara told her own story. She had once lived in the village, but from the moment she was born, people had whispered behind her back. Too big, they had said. Too strange. She would never marry. Even when she was young, no one played with her. She had been mocked, humiliated, and cast aside until one day, she left. Here, in the outskirts, she said, I found peace. She tended her garden, lived alone, and forgot about the cruelty of the village. Until now. Until Jabari. You say you wish to marry me, Amara said at last. But tell me, Hunter, do you seek me because you must? Or because you wish to? Jabari opened his mouth, then paused. Why was he here? Because of the elders. Yes. Because of the spirits. Maybe. But as he looked into Amara's eyes, he felt something else. Respect. Curiosity. Something deeper than duty. I don't know yet, he admitted. But I want to find out. Amara smiled. Then stay for a while, Hunter, she said. Let me show you my world. Jabari hesitated. Then, slowly, he nodded. As the fire crackled between them, he realized something. This was not the end of his journey. It was only the beginning, the hidden truth about the curse. Jabari awoke to the scent of roasting yams and the distant call of birds welcoming the morning. The cool air wrapped around him as he sat up, stretching his tired limbs. He had spent the night outside Amara's hut, his bed a simple woven mat she had given him. For the first time in a long while, he had slept peacefully. Amara stood near the fire, stirring a pot with steady hands. She did not treat him like a guest, nor did she act shy or nervous. She simply existed as she was, calm, strong, and unapologetically herself. Jabari watched her in silence, studying the way she moved, the way she carried herself. She was unlike anyone he had ever met. You should eat, she said without turning around. You have much to learn today. Jabari hesitated. Learn. Amara finally turned to face him, her sharp gaze meeting his. You came here to marry me because the elders told you to. But do you know why they truly sent you? Jabari frowned. To break a curse. Amara smirked. And do you believe that? He opened his mouth, but he hesitated. Did he? Had the spirits truly commanded that he marry the fattest woman in the village? Or was there something more to this story? Amara motioned for him to sit, placing a wooden bowl of roasted yams and goat stew in front of him. You are not the first man to be sent here, she said. But you may be the first to ask questions. Jabari's stomach twisted. Others have come. Amora nodded. Many. And all of them failed. The lies of the elders. As Jabari ate, Amora told him the real story. Long ago, the village of Mabera was ruled by a wise queen, a woman larger than most, yet more powerful than any man. Her name was Queen Naya, and under her rule, the village prospered. But the men of the village grew jealous, Amora said, her voice bitter. They hated that a woman ruled them, especially one who did not fit their image of beauty. So the elders conspired. They spread rumors that Naya was cursed, that her size was a mark of bad fortune. They banished her, casting her into the outskirts, where she died alone and forgotten. But before she died, Amora said, she called upon the spirits and left them with a prophecy. One day, a son of Mabera will be forced to seek a woman like me. If he sees her worth, the village will be saved. If he does not, they will fall to ruin. Jabari shivered. The elders twisted the story, Amora continued. They claimed it was a curse, a punishment for a weak hunter. But in truth, it was a test. A test to see if the village had changed. Jabari's mind raced. He had spent his entire life trying to prove his worth to men who had no honor. And now, he realized, they had sent him here not to lift a curse, but to humiliate him. To make a joke of him, just as they did with Queen Naya. His hands clenched into fists. So what happens if I refuse to marry you? Amora's eyes darkened. Then the spirits will decide what to do with the village. And the men who have mocked you will realize their mistake too late. Jabari's heart pounded. For the first time, he understood, this wasn't just about him. This was about justice. About proving the elders wrong. And maybe, just maybe, it was about choosing his own path. A warning from the village. Jabari spent the rest of the day with Amora, helping her gather herbs, tending to her garden, and listening to her stories. But in the evening, everything changed. A rustling came from the trees. Jabari grabbed his spear, his muscles tensing. Then, out of the shadows, 3 men stepped forward. Ogun, the chief's daughter, Odonor's most loyal follower. A man with broad shoulders and cruel eyes. And behind him, 2 more hunters, men who had mocked Jabari all his life. Well, Ogun sneered, eyeing Amora. So it's true. You're really going through with this madness. Jabari did not move. Why are you here? Ogun crossed his arms. The elders sent us. They want an answer. One of the other men snickered. They want to know if you're actually foolish enough to marry the beast of Mabera. Jabari's blood boiled. But before he could speak, Amora stepped forward. Her presence was calm, but her voice was sharp as a knife. I am no beast, she said. But if you call me that again, you will learn what it means to face one. Ogun hesitated. For a moment, he looked afraid. Then, he sneered. Bah! You are both fools. He turned back to Jabari. You have until the last day of the 7th sun, he said. If you do not return with a bride, the elders will cast you out. Jabari held his ground. I will return when I am ready, he said. And when I do, we will see who is truly cursed. Ogun scowled but did not argue. With a sharp nod, he turned and disappeared into the trees, his men following close behind. Silence filled the clearing. Jabari turned to Amora. She was watching him carefully. You didn't deny me, she said softly. Jabari let out a slow breath. No, he admitted. I didn't. And for the first time, he realized. He did not regret it, the decision. That night, as the fire crackled beside them, Jabari sat deep in thought. If this had been a week ago, he would have laughed at the idea of marrying Amora, but now, he saw her wisdom, her strength, her honor. He saw a woman who had been mocked and abandoned, yet still stood tall. A woman who, in a different world, would have been queen. Jabari finally understood that he had spent his whole life trying to be like the other hunters, trying to prove himself to the village that never saw his worth. But he wasn't like them, and he never would be. His fate was leading him somewhere else. To something greater. Taking a deep breath, he turned to Amora. "Will you come with me?" he asked. Amora raised an eyebrow. "To the village?" Jabari nodded. Amora studied him for a long moment. Then, finally, she smiled. "I will." And just like that, Jabari's fate was sealed. The village of Mabera would never be the same again. The ultimate decision. The journey back to Mabera village was long, but this time, Jabari was not alone. Amora walked beside him, her large frame moving with quiet grace. She did not speak much, but her presence radiated strength. Every so often, Jabari would glance at her, marveling at how different she was from the image the village had painted of her. She was not a monster, she was not a curse, she was simply a woman, one who had endured far more than anyone should. Jabari had made his decision. And he would stand by it. The village reacts. As they neared the village gates, a ripple of whispers spread through the crowd. People gathered, staring in shock and disbelief as Jabari and Amora stepped onto the village grounds. "By the gods!" a woman gasped. "He really did it." Others laughed. "Jabari must be mad," a hunter jeered. "How will he even carry her through the wedding rites?" "Perhaps she will carry him," another man mocked, sending the crowd into howls of laughter. Amora ignored them all, her expression calm. But Jabari's blood boiled. He had always been the one laughed at. The weak hunter, the fool. But now, standing beside Amora, he felt different. Stronger. "Enough!" a booming voice silenced the crowd. The elders had arrived. The great elder, his face wrinkled with wisdom, stepped forward, eyeing Jabari carefully. "You have returned," the elder said. "And you have chosen." Jabari lifted his chin. "I have." The elder's gaze shifted to Amora. Something flickered in his old eyes, recognition, perhaps, or guilt. Then, he turned back to Jabari. "Then the final trial begins." The final trial. The village gathered in the council square, where all major decisions were made. Jabari and Amora stood before the elders, surrounded by hundreds of watching eyes. The great elder stepped forward. "Jabari," he announced, his voice echoing. "You have chosen Amora. But before we honor this union, you must pass the final trial." Jabari's jaw tightened. He had expected this. The elder continued, "For generations, our people have followed the laws of the spirits. Marriage is not just about choice, it is about worthiness." He turned to the crowd. Jabari must complete 3 tasks to prove his strength, wisdom, and heart. If he fails, the marriage is denied, and he will be banished from Mabera forever. A low murmur spread through the crowd. Jabari clenched his fist. He had not expected it to be easy. But he was ready. The great elder raised his hand. "Let the trials begin." Trial 1, Strength of the Heart. Jabari was led to the center of the village, where a massive bull was tied to a wooden post. "The spirits do not ask for physical strength alone," the elder declared. "But for strength of the heart. You must tame this beast, not with force, but with wisdom." The bull snorted, its dark eyes flashing with rage. Hunters murmured amongst themselves. Most men would use a spear or rope. But Jabari was given neither. Only his hands and his wits. The challenge was clear, force would fail. He had to think. Jabari took a deep breath and stepped forward. The bull snorted again, pawing at the dirt. But Jabari did not fight it. Instead, he lowered himself to the ground, sitting cross-legged before the beast. Gasps rippled through the crowd. "He's given up," someone whispered. But Jabari did not move. He simply waited. Minutes passed. The bull huffed, confused. It was used to violence, to men trying to dominate it with force. But Jabari offered no threat. Slowly, the bull calmed, its heavy breathing slowing. Then, it stepped toward him. The crowd fell silent. Jabari reached out, his hand steady. The bull did not run. Instead, it lowered its great head, allowing Jabari to place his hand on its forehead. A roar of disbelief filled the air. The spirits have seen, the elder shouted. Jabari has passed the first trial. Jabari exhaled slowly. 1 down. 2 to go. Trial 2, the test of humility. Jabari was led to a wide circle of villagers. The elder pointed to a group of people who had mocked him most, hunters, women, even children. You must serve them for 1 full day, the elder declared. Without complaint. Without pride. The crowd snickered. They expected Jabari to refuse. But he did not. He spent the next day carrying water, fetching firewood, and cooking meals. Women whispered as he washed dishes. Children laughed as he swept the council square. Even the hunters sneered, making mock requests just to see if he would break. But Jabari did not falter. He had spent his whole life being mocked. But this time, he chose it. And by sunset, something changed. The mocking stopped. The hunters looked less cruel. The women less amused. A child offered him water. And for the first time, the village saw him differently. When he returned to the elders, they nodded in approval. The second trial is complete, the great elder announced. Jabari has proven his humility. 1 more trial remained. Trial 3, the choice of the heart. For the final trial, Jabari was led to the sacred grove, where the great spirit's altar stood. The elder placed 2 items before him. A bag of gold. And a woven bracelet, one belonging to Amara. You must choose, the elder said. 1 path leads to wealth and power, a life free of struggle. The other leads to Amara, a life uncertain, a future unknown. The village held its breath. Jabari knelt, staring at the items. The bag of gold would change his life. But the bracelet, it represented something more. A woman who had been abandoned, forgotten, and cast aside, just like him. A woman who, despite all odds, still stood strong. A woman he had come to admire. Jabari did not hesitate. He picked up the bracelet. The elder smiled. The trials are over, he declared. Jabari has proven himself worthy. A thunderous cheer erupted. And for the first time, Jabari was not mocked. He was honored. A future together. The next morning, Jabari and Amora stood before the village. The elders blessed their union. The hunters bowed their heads in respect. Even Odonor, the chief's daughter, was silent, her face pale with disbelief. Jabari looked at Amora, and for the first time, he saw not just a woman forced upon him, but a partner, an equal, a future. She smiled at him. And Jabari smiled back. The village of Mabera would never be the same again. The trials of the spirits. The village of Mabera had changed overnight. Where once there was mockery, there was now silence. Where once there were jeers, there was now whispered respect. Jabari and Amora stood together in the village square, their union sealed before the elders, but the final test had yet to come. The spirits were watching. And they would decide if Mabera was truly worthy of redemption. The great elder stepped forward, his face grave. You have passed the trials of men, he declared. But now, you must face the trials of the spirits. A hush fell over the crowd. Even the bravest warriors shuddered. No man had ever stood before the spirits and returned unchanged. Jabari's fist tightened. He had come too far to turn back now. He turned to Amora, expecting to see fear in her eyes. But she only nodded, calm as the wind before a storm. The spirits are waiting, she murmured. And we will face them together. Jabari's heart swelled. Then let us go, he said. And so, the final journey began. The path to the sacred grove. The elders led them to the edge of the village, where a single, winding path disappeared into the thick jungle. The sacred grove lies ahead, the great elder said. Beyond its gates, the spirits will test your souls. Jabari nodded. But before he could step forward, the elder lifted a small wooden bowl filled with red earth. You must be marked, he said. Dipping his fingers into the bowl, he drew 3 lines across Jabari's forehead, then turned to Amora and did the same. This will let the spirits know you come in peace, the elder murmured. Jabari could feel the earthy paste drying against his skin, the scent of it rich and ancient. Then, without another word, he and Amora walked into the jungle. The village faded behind them, the world growing silent. Only the whispering trees and the beating of Jabari's heart remained. Trial 1, the beast that cannot be fought. They had walked for hours when the first trial appeared. A roar shattered the silence, deep and earth-rattling. Jabari froze, his spear gripped tightly. From the shadows, a monstrous beast emerged, larger than any lion, darker than the night itself. Its golden eyes burned with hunger, its claws long as daggers. Jabari raised his spear. But before he could strike, Amora's voice stopped him cold. You cannot fight it, she whispered. Jabari turned to her, stunned. If I don't, we will die. Amora shook her head. This is the beast of anger. It feeds on violence and fear. If you attack, it will only grow stronger. Jabari's pulse pounded. The beast snarled, stepping closer. Every instinct screamed at him to fight. But Amora's words held him still. He took a deep breath. And he lowered his spear. The moment he did, the beast hesitated. Jabari forced himself to breathe slower, his hands open, unthreatening. The beast sniffed the air, then, slowly, it faded into smoke, vanishing into the jungle. Jabari let out a long breath. Amora smiled. You passed the first trial, she said. You chose wisdom over strength. Jabari stared at her, then at the empty space where the beast had stood. The spirits were testing more than just his body. They were testing his soul. And they were not done yet. Trial 2, the voices of the past. They walked deeper into the jungle, the air growing heavy, thick with something unseen. Then, the whispers began. Jabari stiffened. They were everywhere, soft, familiar voices, echoing through the trees. Jabari, you will never be great. You are weak. A failure. A woman like Amora will only bring shame upon you. The voices wrapped around him, cold and poisonous. Jabari's breath came short. He knew these words. They had been spoken before, by the hunters, by the villagers, by his own doubts. Jabari, Amora's voice cut through the whispers, steady and sure. He turned to her. She wasn't affected. Why don't they touch you? He asked, his voice shaking. Amora smiled gently. Because I stopped listening long ago. Jabari understood. These voices were not real. They were shadows of the past, only as strong as he let them be. Taking a deep breath, he closed his eyes. The whispers tightened around him, like vines, like chains. But then, he spoke. I am Jabari, son of Keto. And I will not be broken. The whisper screamed, and dissolved into the wind. Amora nodded. You passed the second trial, she said. You chose truth over fear. Jabari felt lighter. He had spent his whole life fighting ghosts. Now, he was finally free. But there was one final trial left. And it would be the hardest of all. Trial 3, the choice that cannot be undone. They reached the heart of the sacred grove, where an ancient tree stood tall, its bark carved with symbols older than time. At its base lay two objects: a crown of gold and a simple woven ring, one that looked just like the bracelet Jabari had chosen before. A voice filled the grove, deep as the earth itself. Choose. Jabari's heart stilled. The choice was clear. The crown meant power. If he chose it, he would rule Mabera, be worshipped as a leader, and never be mocked again. The woven ring meant Amora. No riches. No throne. Only her, and whatever future they built together. The air felt heavy. Jabari took a long breath. And he reached for the woven ring. The moment his fingers touched it, the forest trembled. The ancient tree shook, the ground quivered, and then, just as suddenly, everything fell silent. A gentle wind passed through the trees, warm and welcoming. Amora exhaled. You have passed, she whispered. Jabari turned, heart still pounding. How do you know? She smiled. Because the spirits are at peace. Jabari looked around. The jungle no longer felt heavy. The weight of judgment was gone. He had chosen love over power. And the spirits had accepted it. He took Amora's hand, his grip firm. We should go home, he said. She squeezed his fingers. Yes, she murmured. Home. And together, they walked back toward the village. The trials were over. But their true story was only beginning. The trials of the spirits. The village of Mabera had changed overnight. Where once there was mockery, there was now silence. Where once there were jeers, there was now whispered respect. Jabari and Amora stood together in the village square, their union sealed before the elders, but the final test had yet to come. The spirits were watching. And they would decide if Mabera was truly worthy of redemption. The great elder stepped forward, his face grave. You have passed the trials of men, he declared. But now, you must face the trials of the spirits. A hush fell over the crowd. Even the bravest warriors shuddered. No man had ever stood before the spirits and returned unchanged. Jabari's fist tightened. He had come too far to turn back now. He turned to Amora, expecting to see fear in her eyes. But she only nodded, calm as the wind before a storm. The spirits are waiting, she murmured. And we will face them together. Jabari's heart swelled. Then let us go, he said. And so, the final journey began. The path to the sacred grove. The elders led them to the edge of the village, where a single, winding path disappeared into the thick jungle. The sacred grove lies ahead, the great elder said. Beyond its gates, the spirits will test your souls. Jabari nodded. But before he could step forward, the elder lifted a small wooden bowl filled with red earth. You must be marked, he said. Dipping his fingers into the bowl, he drew 3 lines across Jabari's forehead, then turned to Amora and did the same. This will let the spirits know you come in peace, the elder murmured. Jabari could feel the earthy paste drying against his skin, the scent of it rich and ancient. Then, without another word, he and Amora walked into the jungle. The village faded behind them, the world growing silent. Only the whispering trees and the beating of Jabari's heart remained. Trial 1, the beast that cannot be fought. They had walked for hours when the first trial appeared. A roar shattered the silence, deep and earth-rattling. Jabari froze, his spear gripped tightly. From the shadows, a monstrous beast emerged, larger than any lion, darker than the night itself. Its golden eyes burned with hunger, its claws long as daggers. Jabari raised his spear. But before he could strike, Amora's voice stopped him cold. You cannot fight it, she whispered. Jabari turned to her, stunned. If I don't, we will die. Amora shook her head. This is the beast of anger. It feeds on violence and fear. If you attack, it will only grow stronger. Jabari's pulse pounded. The beast snarled, stepping closer. Every instinct screamed at him to fight. But Amora's words held him still. He took a deep breath. And he lowered his spear. The moment he did, the beast hesitated. Jabari forced himself to breathe slower, his hands open, unthreatening. The beast sniffed the air, then, slowly, it faded into smoke, vanishing into the jungle. Jabari let out a long breath. Amora smiled. You passed the first trial, she said. You chose wisdom over strength. Jabari stared at her, then at the empty space where the beast had stood. The spirits were testing more than just his body. They were testing his soul. And they were not done yet. Trial 2, the voices of the past. They walked deeper into the jungle, the air growing heavy, thick with something unseen. Then, the whispers began. Jabari stiffened. They were everywhere, soft, familiar voices, echoing through the trees. Jabari, you will never be great. You are weak. A failure. A woman like Amora will only bring shame upon you. The voices wrapped around him, cold and poisonous. Jabari's breath came short. He knew these words. They had been spoken before, by the hunters, by the villagers, by his own doubts. Jabari, Amora's voice cut through the whispers, steady and sure. He turned to her. She wasn't affected. Why don't they touch you? He asked, his voice shaking. Amora smiled gently. Because I stopped listening long ago. Jabari understood. These voices were not real. They were shadows of the past, only as strong as he let them be. Taking a deep breath, he closed his eyes. The whispers tightened around him, like vines, like chains. But then, he spoke. I am Jabari, son of Keto. And I will not be broken. The whisper screamed, and dissolved into the wind. Amora nodded. You passed the second trial, she said. You chose truth over fear. Jabari felt lighter. He had spent his whole life fighting ghosts. Now, he was finally free. But there was one final trial left. And it would be the hardest of all. Trial 3, the choice that cannot be undone. They reached the heart of the sacred grove, where an ancient tree stood tall, its bark carved with symbols older than time. At its base lay two objects. A crown of gold. And a simple woven ring, one that looked just like the bracelet Jabari had chosen before. A voice filled the grove, deep as the earth itself. Choose. Jabari's heart stilled. The choice was clear. The crown meant power. If he chose it, he would rule Mabera, be worshipped as a leader, and never be mocked again. The woven ring meant Amora. No riches. No throne. Only her, and whatever future they built together. The air felt heavy. Jabari took a long breath. And he reached for the woven ring. The moment his fingers touched it, the forest trembled. The ancient tree shook, the ground quivered, and then, just as suddenly, everything fell silent. A gentle wind passed through the trees, warm and welcoming. Amora exhaled. You have passed, she whispered. Jabari turned, heart still pounding. How do you know? She smiled. Because the spirits are at peace. Jabari looked around. The jungle no longer felt heavy. The weight of judgment was gone. He had chosen love over power. And the spirits had accepted it. He took Amora's hand, his grip firm. We should go home, he said. She squeezed his fingers. Yes, she murmured. Home. And together, they walked back toward the village. The trials were over. But their true story was only beginning. The new era. The celebrations lasted for 3 days and 3 nights. The village of Mabera had never witnessed a union like this, one not built on power, wealth, or appearances, but on true strength, wisdom, and love. The people danced beneath the moon, their voices singing songs of renewal. Jabari and Amora sat side by side, watching the joy unfold. They were no longer outcast. They were no longer the subjects of whispers. They were leaders of a new era. And soon, change would come. The first morning as husband and wife. When the celebrations finally ended, Jabari and Amora woke to a new dawn. The village felt different, as if the very air had shifted. No more jeers. No more mockery. Only curious eyes and cautious respect. As Jabari stepped outside, the village elders were waiting. Jabari, the great elder said, his voice heavy with unspoken meaning. You have passed the trials, and the spirits have accepted your union. But there is one more duty that remains. Jabari frowned. Duty. The elder nodded. You and Amora are not just husband and wife. You are the ones who have brought change to Mabera. And so, we ask, will you lead us? A new kind of leadership. The council of elders gathered that afternoon, discussing what was to come next. For generations, Mabera had been ruled by tradition and rigid beliefs. Men led, and only men of strength were respected. Women were valued for beauty rather than wisdom. An outcast like Jabari and Amora had no place in leadership. Until now. The people looked to them, not out of fear, but out of hope. Amora stood before the council, her voice strong and unwavering. This village has spent years believing that strength is found in force, and that worth is found in appearances, she said. But the spirits have shown us otherwise. Jabari stepped beside her. We will not rule as past leaders have, he declared. We will not judge people by their size, their strength, or their status. He turned to the crowd. We will judge them by their hearts. The village erupted in cheers. For the first time in history, Mabera would have leaders who led with wisdom, kindness, and fairness. And for the first time, the people welcomed it. The fate of Odono. But there was still one matter left unresolved. Odono, the chief's daughter, had spent years believing herself above others. She had mocked Jabari. She had tried to sabotage his wedding. And in the end, she had been stripped of her privilege. Now, she stood before the council, her head bowed in shame. What shall be done with her? One elder asked. The people murmured. Some said she should be banished, as she had tried to banish Jabari once. Others believed she should be punished. But Amora spoke first. Let her serve, she said. Odono looked up, startled. Amora continued, let her walk among the people, learn humility, and prove that she can change. Jabari nodded. Everyone deserves a second chance, he added. Even those who once wronged us. The elders agreed, and the punishment was set. Odono would spend the next year living among the common people, serving them, learning from them. And if she proved herself worthy, she would be welcomed back, not as a chief's daughter, but as one of them. For the first time, Odono did not argue. She simply bowed her head and accepted her fate. A harvest of change. Months passed, and under Jabari and Amora's rule, Mabera flourished. The fields grew greener. The river, once drying, flowed strong again. People no longer feared change. Women were welcomed into leadership. Hunters were no longer judged by size or strength, but by skill and intelligence. And those who had once been mocked and shunned found a place among their people. Even Odono, once cruel and proud, had begun to change. She walked the fields, fetched water for the elders, and learned to listen instead of speak. It was not easy. But she was trying. And the people saw it. A legacy for the future. One evening, Jabari and Amora stood on a hill overlooking the village, watching the sunset paint the sky in gold and crimson. So much has changed, Jabari murmured. Amora smiled. And it will continue to change. Jabari turned to her. Did you ever think this would be our life? She laughed softly. I once thought I would spend my life alone, forgotten by the world, she admitted. But you saw me, Jabari. And I saw you. She took his hand. And that was enough to change everything. Jabari squeezed her fingers, his heart warm. They had started as outcasts. But they had become more than anyone had ever imagined. And now, their story would be told for generations. The tale of Jabari and Amora, the hunter and the woman the village once abandoned. A story not about strength. Not about power. But about seeing beyond the surface, and choosing love even when the world stood against it. As the stars shimmered above them, Jabari whispered one final vow. This is only the beginning. And Amora smiled, knowing it was true.